I want to speak to you tonight about the political realities faced by the government of Howard Pawley in 1983 and 1984. That's what I was asked to talk about, but first I think to put it in context, a bit of background. Some of you know the background. Roger has touched on some of it, but I think it's important to understand that the Pawley government was faced with a constitutional challenge with respect to the validity of all Manitoba legislation from 1890 up till 1980. And to avoid the risk of a successful challenge, the government entered into an agreement to amend Section 23 of the Manitoba Act to reaffirm, and I use the word reaffirm deliberately, French as an official language of Manitoba, so as to avoid massive costs for translation of spent legislation and orders in council and regulations in exchange for a reduced translation burden, and instead substituting the cost of that with dramatically increased services in French language services to the Franco-Manitoban community. Unfortunately, and I've just done it deliberately for you, that was originally articulated as a question of a trade-off on cost rather than a trade-off on principle. Some of us found that rather repugnant, but the government of the day, and very much part of the mentality of the government, which had been thrown off its economic agenda by a court challenge, wanted to put this in the context of a question of cost as much as a question of rights. Many in the government, on the other hand, also saw it as a question of rights. And we'll talk about that in terms of some of the debates that went on inside government. I was joking earlier this evening with my former colleague Gerard Lecuyer, who is here this evening and was MLA for Radisson at the time, that the Cabinet and Caucus 30-year secrecy provision, in terms of not violating those provisions, will be up next year. And I was suggesting 30 years is a long time, maybe 29 is enough. So I'm going to say some things tonight I probably, well, Howard Pawley might not have said. He's a little stricter about following those rules. Manitoba was a bilingual province, as you know, since its creation in 1870, and the history of how that duality of status was eroded is a sorry tale of denial by various governments over 90 years, right up to 1980, including the Schreier government. And it wasn't, and Howard Pawley admits it in his personal memoir, that in 1976, he stood in the way of Georges Forest and the effort to get to the Court of Appeal. However, after the Forest and Blakey decisions by the Supreme Court in '79, the Sterling Lyon government introduced legislation in 1980 that attempted to avoid the requirement that all legislation had to be enacted in both official languages by saying it will be good enough if afterwards there's a translation provided in French. Of course, the court, as Roger said, the court later threw that out as an invalid provision. However, like Roger, I'd like to congratulate Sterling Lyon. He did one thing right. He actually, in Bill 2, repealed the Official Language Act of 1890. When I first arrived in Manitoba in '73, I looked in the consolidated statutes and saw this act. And I went to Legislative Council and said, "What's this doing here?" It was declared ultra vires the province. And the Legislative Council of the day, Ray Talon, a very honorable man, said, "Don't ask, Andy." There's a lot of history to this. At the same time this was happening, Roger Bilodeau was headed for the Supreme Court of Canada on a challenge to the unilingually enacted Highway Traffic Act and an appeal from the Manitoba Court of Appeal. And that's when the Pawley government chose the route, and I think a highly principled route, of trying to find an agreement that would be much more practical than translating all those laws and avoid the risk. The parties were Bilodeau, the federal government, the provincial government, and the SFM. I love to tell the story about the challenge I had in the House about the status of the SFM, and I pointed out, because there were some on the other side who always thought the SFM should have no rights to be party to any of these discussions. One day I decided to point out to the opposition that the SFM was created by a special act of the legislature that was actually passed when Walter Weir was Premier.
Oh, that I didn't know.
So the official opposition, led by Sterling Lyon, were aware of the negotiations that led to this agreement. There's no secret about that. They were also given a copy of the draft agreement, but kept their powder dry, or as Roland Penner said at the time, hid in the weeds. They were not directly involved. The proposed amendment was prematurely revealed by the Prime Minister of Canada to a Liberal meeting here in Saint-Boniface on the 16th of May before the government was ready to announce it, and we felt totally blindsided. Wouldn't be the first time Trudeau blindsided somebody, but with our government it was a very difficult time, because the official opposition came out guns blazing, vociferously opposing the agreement. Then they created immediately a firestorm of legislative and public opposition. And I think they knew what they were doing. I don't think they let this happen just by accident. They tapped into an antipathy that was just under the surface to official bilingualism at the federal level, and a fear that that might be coming to Manitoba. We tried to explain the agreement. Roger was out traveling on the road with Roland Penner and constitutional experts from the Manitoba Law School at Robson Hall, explaining the law, explaining the agreement, and made almost no progress at all over the summer. We then recessed for a series of lengthy hearings, province-wide over 5 weeks, that I was asked to chair, and at which Attorney General Penner proposed changes to the constitutional amendment. Then in January 1984, when we came back from the recess, we tabled further proposed changes by placing the expanded French language service provisions in statute law, Bill 115, rather than in the Manitoba Act, which was quite disappointing to many members of the Francophone community. Also during the recess, referenda were held in many municipalities, I think 23 altogether.
Something like that.
Yeah. The results showed, and including Winnipeg, which was rather significant. The results showed a large majority of the public opposed to the agreement, and this further emboldened the opponents and increased the volume and the intensity of their rhetoric. Shortly after that, I was appointed government house leader and minister responsible for the amendment. Not an appointment I sought. I can tell you I went home after the Premier offered me that position on a Thursday evening. I refused to give him an answer that Thursday afternoon. I went home and told my wife, who was a St. Boniface native, and told her what the Premier wanted me to do. And she made a very prescient remark. She said, "We'll lose Springfield, but you've got to do it." She was right, but we did it. The House reconvened in January '84, and the official opposition's refusal to appear in the House for the required votes ultimately resulted in the government abandoning the constitutional amendment and the corollary legislation, Bill 115, on February 27, 1984. You may remember, and I mention this more parenthetically than anything else, you may remember that Prime Minister Trudeau's resignation followed 2 days later. And I've often wondered whether that was influenced in any way by our failure to pass the constitutional amendment and his disappointment in another step backwards for his vision of Canada, a vision that I personally shared. He said on October 6th, I think it was, the day the first resolution was passed by the House of Commons, in the fall, in early October 1983, the House passed the first resolution supporting the Manitoba Act amendment. And Trudeau said that he thought it was perhaps, and I quote, "the most important day of my life as a parliamentarian." So he thought of this as very, very significant. So I've always thought that in some ways his disappointment at what we were unable to do successfully in Manitoba may have precipitated his walk in the snow. So that's a bit of the historical background for those of you who don't know it as well as many of you do in this room, because I know many of you know this as well as I do, except for the personal stuff. The negative views of many Manitobans towards official bilingualism federally and in Manitoba were rooted in a very different perception of Canada because of the demographics of Western Canada and how different they were to the demographics of Eastern Canada, where I grew up. And in fact, I was quite taken aback by some of the things I heard and saw during the French language constitutional issue, or what we euphemistically just referred to as FLS. Their Canada, these Western Canadians, their sense of Canada, whether they were the sons of the Orange Lodge who emigrated from southern Ontario in the 1880s and 1890s, I call them the second sons. You know, the problem with the English is they have primogeniture. The French just kept dividing the land. The English, the first son got it all, and the second son was sent to Manitoba, and the third and the fourth and the fifth. They got a grub stake. It's true. You're laughing. It's true. That's why southwestern Manitoba was homesteaded by the second sons of Orange, Ontario. Look it up. So what you have in Western Canada is a view that French Canadians, at least those French Canadians in Western Canada, because they were the only ones they knew anything about, as Quebec was a long ways away, were just another minority, just like Ukrainians, Germans, or any other group, the Icelanders. These people weren't bigots. They just had a different understanding of Canada. And I think, to some extent, that perception was acknowledged by Manitoba's Francophone community. Perhaps grudgingly, but acknowledged nonetheless. I remember when I was thinking about speaking here tonight, I recalled the SFM's button that said, Nous ne sommes pas les ethniques. It was a nice big button put out by the SFM at the time. In fact, I went looking to see if I could find the one I'd kept. Fortunately, I couldn't. Nous ne sommes pas les ethniques. Initially, I thought this slogan was very creative. That says it. We're one of the two founding ethnic groups of this country. We're not ethnics. We're founding people. But what it did was it reinforced the notion that the Francophone community saw itself as a founding people, and the rest of Manitoba did not see the Francophone community that way. It reinforced that demographic distinction that occurs in Western Canada. And these perceptions were also reinforced by ignorance of the linguistic duality of Canada since Confederation and the parallel duality of Manitoba from 1870 to the present time. That ignorance begot, it was ignorance. It wasn't bigotry for the most part, but it begat fear of changed status for other minorities. So if only the English are first class, I had rational people tell me this, rational thinking people tell me that they feared becoming relegated to third class because the French could never make first class, therefore the French would be second class and all the rest of us would be third class. Well, I never followed the logic of that. But for me, that ignorance speaks to the failure of our educational system and the reluctance of governments and the leadership of our society's elites, the churches, the schools, ethnic organizations, to shape public opinion and to educate people. I don't think it speaks to bigotry. I think ignorance and fear are a different channel than the bigotry of the extreme right wing, or what Raymond will call the authoritarians. I had a Beausejour area farmer say his ability to farm would be compromised by making French an official language. Why? No, there was logic to this. We laugh. And I laughed at the time until he said, but hold it, Andy. Okay? And this was based in ignorance. He thought he was going to have to learn French to be able to farm. Why? Because all the labels on the pesticide and herbicide cans were going to be in French only. Well, if he believed that, if somebody told him that, then he would feel threatened in terms of his livelihood. And he did feel threatened. That's not to say there wasn't outright bigotry out there. It was demonstrated by some of the most vociferous opponents of the agreement. There was a rabid radical fringe who were simply anti-French, and on top of that they hated Pierre Trudeau, who they saw as the mastermind behind this ill-conceived agreement, and they were not all right-wing conservatives. There were others who had their own political agenda, such as Russ Dorn and Jim Walding, both of whom chafed at being left out of the Pawley cabinet. As well, there was a problem with the official opposition conservatives. As Roger said earlier, Lyon may have had his head screwed on right when he was the premier, but he was a chastised, bitter man when we faced him in opposition. And they fomented the right-wing extremist rage, but very quickly, grassroots and other organizations took over leadership of opposition to the agreement, and the conservatives became virtually their captives. More of that later. For example, the vitriol that was spouted at one of the hearings, actually the Standing Committee of Privileges and Elections hearing in Brandon, made me realize there was a palpable and deep-seated hatred for official bilingualism that I had never heard before. I saw a side of Manitoba and of the people of Manitoba that I didn't even know existed. And it translated, it wasn't just official bilingualism, it translated into a palpable feeling of being anti-French, period. I recall telling my good friend Harry Enns, believe it or not, and Gerard will attest to this, there are friends across political parties in the legislature. Harry was my counterpart as official opposition House leader, and I recall telling him that they were riding a tiger that they'd unleashed. And he didn't disagree with me. Harry Enns always spoke frankly to me because we had been old friends from my days as deputy clerk in the legislature when I was scrupulously nonpartisan and had friends on both sides of the House. When Bud Sherman, as deputy leader of the official opposition, introduced an amendment to the constitutional motion, some of you may remember that midway through the winter debate, the Conservatives tried a compromise amendment. It was early in '84. I immediately praised their amendment publicly as going a long way towards reconciling our differences, but not quite enough. The very next day, Harry told me privately that my comments were not helpful because they generated a lot of pressure on Tory caucus members from the public opponents who were now accusing the Tories of caving in. He told me that the Tory caucus had a difficult time agreeing to go as far as they had. Sherman was deputy leader. He was acting for Philman. Philman had pushed to get this compromise against the wishes of the rural rump of his caucus. They'd gone this far, and now they had all this public blowback. And Harry said, I generated that public blowback to a large extent by my comments, and it was reinforcing the position of the mainly right-wing rural portion, which included, of course, Sterling. Pierre Trudeau was frustrated by our government's ability to get the Speaker to call the vote in the face of the incessant bell ringing. The bells rang more than the House sat, I think, in January and February. He asked me at one point whether we would consider replacing the Speaker. He also offered procedural advice from table officers of the House of Commons, but of course I'd already talked to them because I'd known them from the 70s. Some of them were friends of mine. We tapped every resource we could to get procedural advice to find a way to deal with it. I had to explain to the Prime Minister that we couldn't introduce additional motions since anything we introduced became ringable. It was a new parliamentary term added to the parliamentary lexicon. It didn't last because a couple of years later we managed to change the rules, put a limit on bell ringing, and ringable was no longer a parliamentary term. But for that winter, and whether or not a motion was debatable and therefore when pushed to a vote was ringable, was a very important consideration in parliamentary tactics. The opposition was so emboldened by the Speaker's refusal to call them in that they would delay votes on anything that might procedurally end run their opposition. So if we wanted to do anything else to try and find a way to fix it, including the final ultimate bell ringing of 163 hours, it was on a procedural motion to limit bell ringing. It wasn't even on the constitutional amendment or Bill 115. Most people forget that. So they had the opportunity, and we would have needed 2 more votes at least just to get Bill 115 through the House, let alone the constitutional amendment. If they decided to walk out for 3 weeks on each of those, we would have been well into April. So the Speaker had effectively put the Tories in the driver's seat, and in doing so, probably protected himself as well. I'm not suggesting that we would have replaced the Speaker, but any discussion about replacing the Speaker became moot because the motion to replace the Speaker was ringable. Speaker Walding was also personally opposed to the agreement. Most people don't know this. I don't even know if Gerard knows this, but I privately met with Speaker Walding before the House resumed in January, early '84, and his opposition was apparent from his questions and challenges of me at the time. He subsequently made procedural rulings that clearly were influenced by his views. His rulings showed that he looked for any grounds, any small point on which he could deny the government progress in the House. There was a fundamental attitude in Speaker Walding that was opposed to what we were doing, and he let that influence him. And it was typical. I can tell you parenthetically as well that there was an issue arose with respect to a parliamentary gathering, and he refused to sign letters of reply prepared for him in French to French-speaking counterparts in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association because he couldn't read French and claimed, therefore, he couldn't be sure the translation was accurate. They should write to me in English, he said. So we were dealing fundamentally with a person who was opposed to what the government was doing. So his rulings were colored by his own prejudice. I've been asked many times why we prorogued the legislature when we did, and I tell you tonight it was a purely pragmatic decision with which I disagreed at the time and I still think was wrong-headed. We could have waited out the official opposition to see whether they would honor the 2-week bell ringing limit that we had unwisely agreed to the previous August. I wasn't the House leader who agreed to that. However, the majority of the government caucus didn't trust the Tories. They didn't think they'd honor the 2-week limit. And of course, after the prorogation, the Tories immediately stood on their high horses and said they would have kept their word. But I had asked Harry Enns many times whether they would honor the 2-week bell ringing agreement, and he always said, just wait and see, Andy. So I couldn't get a commitment. If they'd rung the bells in the next motion that were required to complete the passage of the resolution, the constitutional amending resolution, and Bill 115, the government would have faced financial constraints because of the urgent need for parliamentary supply before the March 31st year-end approached. And with the House in session, you can't get parliamentary supply without an actual appropriations bill. Of course, if you take in an appropriation bill, it's ringable. So after the House prorogued, the funding was granted by special warrant without any trouble. Despite this funding issue, though, I want to tell you the political reality we faced if the government ran out of money. The U.S. congressional term fiscal cliff hadn't been invented yet, but it was a Manitoba cliff. A sizable minority of the government caucus wanted to stay the course. And I will tell you something tonight that I don't think has ever been revealed before, and Gerard will shoot me for it later. Out of 30 caucus votes, 23 were in favor of prorogation, 7, almost a quarter, were opposed. And 2 of those votes were in this room tonight. And I will tell you who the other votes were. In addition to Gerard Lecuyer, Larry Desjardins, Pete, Amy, Adam from St. Rose, Elijah Harper, who knows what it's like to be a member of a minority. As Elijah said one time in caucus, and again I'm revealing something that's not quite 30 years old, if they can do this to white francophones, think of what they can do to my people. And he was right. And he held his feather 6 years later on Meach and stood up for what he believed in. And then there was Don Scott, the member from Inkster, Roland Penner, and myself. Those were the 7 votes. That doesn't mean the others were less honorable. They didn't believe the Tories. Gerard and I and our 5 colleagues were prepared to call their bluff. We might have called their bluff and they might have gone out for 2 more weeks on something else, at which time we all would have voted to prorogue, because then we'd know it had been hopeless. So the political reality of prorogation was pragmatism over principle, but it was also driven to a lesser extent, as I said in my opening remarks, by the government's sense that, at least a majority of caucus's sense, that we were driven off an economic agenda, which was the agenda on which we'd been elected only 2 years before, because of the serious economic constraints in which Manitoba found itself, and the reason Sterling Lyon was defeated. We were driven off that agenda by this unknown, unpredictable constitutional problem. Nonetheless, some of us strongly believe that economic justice without recognition of rights is an empty victory. And that's why we stayed the course and fought right to the end for the principle. Thank you very much.